The morning of November 15, 1951, dawned gray and bitter over Willowmere Township, Pennsylvania. A thin layer of frost clung to the dying cornfields that stretched endlessly toward the Allegheny foothills, and the skeletal branches of oak trees scraped against the pewter sky like desperate fingers. The temperature hovered just above freezing, but the wind carried the promise of the season's first real snow. In the small farming community where everyone knew everyone else's business, where church bells marked time more reliably than pocket watches, and where the arrival of the morning school bus was as routine as sunrise itself, November 15th should have been just another ordinary Thursday. It wasn't. At 7:23 a.m., Rosalind McKinnon pressed her face against the frosted window of her family's farmhouse, watching her breath fog the glass as she waited for the familiar yellow shape of Bus Route 7 to round the bend near Hendrix's pasture. At 11 years old, Rosie was the unofficial leader of the children who rode the route, a spirited girl with copper braids and freckles who could solve arithmetic problems faster than most adults and wasn't afraid to speak her mind when the older boys got too rowdy. "Rosie, your lunch pail," called her mother, Edith McKinnon, from the kitchen. The woman's voice carried the weary cadence of someone who'd been up since 4 milking cows and preparing breakfast for a household of 6. "And button your coat proper. Weather's turning." Rosie grabbed the dented metal pail containing her usual meal: 2 slices of bread with apple butter, a hard-boiled egg, and if they were lucky that week, a small piece of her mother's molasses cake. She wrapped her wool scarf tighter around her neck and stepped onto the porch, just as the distant rumble of the school bus engine echoed across the frozen fields. 3 miles east, 10-year-old Theodore Ashworth was already waiting at his stop, shifting from foot to keep warm. Teddy was the quiet one, the boy who preferred books to baseball and spent his free time sketching birds in the margins of his composition notebooks. His thick-rimmed glasses were constantly fogging in the cold air, forcing him to clean them with the sleeve of his patched coat every few minutes. The Ashworth farm had seen better days. Teddy's father had lost most of their livestock to disease the previous spring, and the family had been scraping by on what little they could grow in their vegetable garden and the few dollars Teddy's mother earned taking in washing. But despite their struggles, Mrs. Ashworth always made sure her son looked presentable for school, his brown hair neatly combed and his face scrubbed clean. As the bus appeared over the hill, its familiar diesel engine coughing black smoke into the morning air, Teddy clutched his canvas book bag tighter and rehearsed the presentation he was supposed to give that day about the migration patterns of mourning doves. He'd been working on it for weeks, using every bird-watching expedition as research. At the next stop, half a mile down County Road 47, 9-year-old Vivian Hartley waited with her older brother Douglas. Viv was the dreamer of the group, always inventing elaborate stories about the people they passed on their way to school. She'd convinced herself that old Mr. Kowalski, who lived alone in the ramshackle house near the mill, was actually a European count in hiding, and that Mrs. Bellwether's cat could predict the weather by the way it sat on the porch. Douglas, at 13, was ready to be done with elementary school and start working on his family's dairy farm full-time. He tolerated his little sister's flights of fancy with the patient resignation of someone who'd been listening to her chatter for 9 years. Today, Viv was particularly excited because she'd finished her book report on the secret garden and was convinced it was the best thing she'd ever written. "Dougie, do you think Miss Patterson will read my report to the whole class?" she asked, bouncing on her toes as the bus approached. "Sure, Viv," Douglas replied absently, his attention focused on the strange way the bus was moving, slower than usual, with an odd hitching motion that made the engine sound labored. The final regular passenger on Route 7 was 8-year-old Leonard Fitzgerald, whose family ran the only general store in Willowmere Township. Lenny was small for his age, but possessed a sharp wit and an encyclopedic knowledge of baseball statistics that impressed even the high school boys. He lived closest to town, which meant he was always the last one picked up and the first one dropped off. On this particular morning, Lenny was carrying a special cargo, a shoebox containing his prized collection of baseball cards, which he planned to show to his classmates during recess. He'd been saving his allowance for months to buy packs of Bowman cards, and he'd finally managed to complete the entire Philadelphia Athletics roster. The bus, a 1947 International Harvester, KB5, painted the regulation school bus yellow, belonged to the township and was driven by Frank Kowalski, son of the mysterious Mr. Kowalski that Viv liked to speculate about. Frank was 24 years old, recently returned from the Pacific Theater, where he'd served as a mechanic with the Navy. He was a quiet, reliable young man who took his responsibility for the children's safety seriously. But Frank had been troubled lately. His father's health was declining, and the old man's increasingly erratic behavior was becoming the subject of whispered conversations throughout the township. The previous week, neighbors had found the elder Kowalski wandering the fields at midnight, claiming he was searching for his long-dead wife. Frank was torn between his duty to the children and his worry about leaving his father alone during the day. On the morning of November 15th, Frank had arrived at the township garage earlier than usual to check the bus. The engine had been running rough for the past few days, and the November cold wasn't helping. The mechanic, Joe Brennan, had assured him the vehicle was safe to drive, but Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As he pulled up to Rosie's stop, Frank noticed the children seemed more subdued than usual. Perhaps it was the gloomy weather, or maybe they were just tired. He cranked open the door and mustered his usual smile. "Morning, Rosie. Cold enough for you?" "Morning, Mr. Kowalski," Rosie replied, climbing the steep steps and taking her customary seat behind the driver. She always sat there because she liked to watch Frank navigate the winding country roads, and she enjoyed their brief conversations about everything from the weather to the latest news from the Korean War. The pickup routine continued as it had every school day for the past 2 months. Teddy climbed aboard at his stop, adjusting his glasses and nodding shyly at Rosie before taking his usual seat halfway back. The Hartley siblings were next, with Viv chattering excitedly about her book report while Douglas slumped into the back seat with the resigned air of a teenager who'd rather be anywhere else. Finally, they reached Lenny's stop near the general store. The boy bounded up the steps with his precious shoebox tucked under his arm, his cheeks red from the cold. "What have you got there, sport?" Frank asked, glancing in the rearview mirror as Lenny settled into his seat. "Baseball cards," Lenny announced proudly. "I have got the whole athletics team now, even Gus Zernial's rookie card." The other children turned to look with interest. Even Douglas seemed impressed, and Viv immediately began peppering Lenny with questions about his collection. As they pulled away from the general store and headed toward Willowmere Elementary, the atmosphere on the bus was lighter than it had been all morning. Frank felt some of his earlier tension ease as he listened to the children's animated conversation. This was why he'd taken the job. Not for the modest pay, but for moments like these, when he felt like he was providing something important for these kids. But as they crested the hill near Hensley's Bend, about 2 miles from the school, Frank noticed something that made his stomach clench with worry. A dark sedan was parked on the shoulder of the road ahead, its hood raised and steam rising from the engine. A man in a long coat stood beside the vehicle, waving his arms as if flagging down help. Frank's military training had taught him to be suspicious of situations that seemed too convenient, too staged. But his natural compassion, and the fact that he was driving a bus full of children who would witness whatever decision he made, compelled him to slow down. The man appeared to be in his 40s, well-dressed, despite the early hour, with salt and pepper hair visible beneath his fedora. As Frank brought the bus to a stop, the man approached the driver's side window with what appeared to be genuine relief. "Thank God," the stranger said, his breath visible in the cold air. "My car's overheated, and I have been stranded here for 20 minutes. I don't suppose you could give me a ride to the nearest town? I'm expected at an important business meeting in Pittsburgh this afternoon." Frank hesitated. District policy strictly prohibited picking up unauthorized passengers on school buses, but the man seemed harmless enough, and it was clear his car had broken down. The children had grown quiet, pressing their faces to the windows to watch the interaction. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't take passengers on a school bus," Frank said through the partially opened window. "But Willomere's just about 2 miles ahead. There's a garage there. Brennan's service. They could send a tow truck." The man's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something annoyance, calculation, crossing his features before the grateful smile returned. "Of course, I understand completely," he said. "Safety first, especially with precious cargo like that." He gestured toward the bus windows where the children's faces were visible. "Perhaps you could at least tell me, is there a telephone at this garage you mentioned?" "Yes, sir, and I will make sure to mention to Joe Brennan that you are stranded out here. He's good about helping folks in trouble." "That's very kind of you, young man. Very kind indeed." As Frank prepared to pull away, he caught sight of the stranger's car license plate in his side mirror. Something about it nagged at him. The numbers and letters seemed somehow familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen them before. The rest of the ride to school passed without incident. The children resumed their conversations. Lenny showed off his baseball cards to an increasingly interested audience, and Viv regaled everyone with her latest theory about why Mrs. Patterson always wore the same blue dress on Thursdays. Frank pulled into the familiar circular driveway in front of Willowmere Elementary at exactly 8:15 a.m., right on schedule. The brick building looked warm and inviting despite the gloomy morning, with yellow light spilling from the windows and smoke rising from the chimney. One by one, the children gathered their belongings and filed off the bus. Rosie was last, as always, and she paused at the top of the steps. "Mr. Kowalski, that man back there, something seems strange about him, don't you think?" Frank was surprised by her observation. He'd been so focused on following protocol that he hadn't realized how the encounter might have appeared to the children. "What made you think that, Rosie?" She frowned, searching for the right words. "I don't know exactly. It was just, his car looked too nice to be broken down, and his shoes were really shiny, like he hadn't been walking around on a dirt road." Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. Children often notice things that adults missed, their observations unfiltered by social expectations or politeness. "You are a smart girl, Rosie. Always trust your instincts." She beamed at the compliment and hurried toward the school building, her copper braids bouncing as she ran to catch up with her classmates. The school day proceeded normally, or at least it seemed to. Miss Patterson praised Viv's book report, as predicted. Teddy gave his presentation about mourning doves to an attentive classroom. Lenny's baseball cards were the hit of recess, with several older boys offering to trade their lunch desserts for a chance to hold Gus Cernial's rookie card. Douglas spent most of his time staring out the window, counting the hours until he could go home and help with the evening milking. But beneath the routine surface of spelling tests and arithmetic problems, something indefinable had shifted. Perhaps it was the increasingly overcast sky, or the way the wind had picked up, rattling the school windows. Perhaps it was the memory of the stranded motorist that continued to nag at Frank as he waited in the parking lot for dismissal time. At 3:30 p.m., the final bell rang, and the children of Willowmere Elementary poured out into the gray afternoon. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and the wind now carried the distinct smell of approaching snow. Frank cranked the engine and pulled up to the loading area. The children climbed aboard in reverse order from the morning. Lenny first, followed by the Hartley siblings, then Teddy and finally Rosie. But something was different about their usual chatter. The excitement from the morning had faded, replaced by the tired quietness that often settled over children at the end of a long school day. Even Viv seemed subdued, staring out the window instead of launching into one of her elaborate stories. As they pulled out of the school parking lot and onto County Road 47, Frank noticed that the dark sedan was no longer parked at Hensley's Bend. Either the mysterious motorist had found help, or someone had indeed come to tow his vehicle. Frank made a mental note to ask Joe Brennan about it when he got a chance. The first part of the route proceeded normally. Frank dropped Lenny off at the general store, where the boy's mother was waiting on the porch, a worried expression on her face that seemed disproportionate to the gray afternoon. "You drive careful now, Frank," Mrs. Fitzgerald called out as Lenny ran toward the house. "Radio says we might get our first real snow tonight." "Yes, ma'am. I will take it slow." The next stop was the Hartley farm. Douglas and Viv gathered their things and made their way to the front of the bus. But as they reached the door, Viv turned back toward her classmates. "See you tomorrow, everyone," she said with unusual solemnity. "Take care going home." There was something almost prophetic about her words, though none of them could have known it at the time. With the Hartley children safely delivered to their farm, Frank continued toward Teddy's stop. The boy was absorbed in a book about North American birds, his nose practically pressed against the pages despite the dimming light. "How's the bird watching going, Teddy?" Frank asked, trying to lighten the mood that seemed to have settled over the bus. "Good, sir. I spotted a red-winged blackbird yesterday, which is unusual for this time of year. They should have migrated south by now. Maybe he's just a stubborn one. Doesn't want to leave home." Teddy smiled at that, the first real smile Frank had seen from any of the children all afternoon. As they approached the Ashworth farm, Frank noticed that Teddy's mother wasn't waiting at the usual spot by the mailbox. This was unusual. Mrs. Ashworth was always punctual, always there to greet her son with a wave and a smile. Frank slowed the bus and cranked open the door. Teddy gathered his book bag and stood up, but he too seemed to notice his mother's absence. "That's strange," the boy murmured. "Mama's always here." "Maybe she got delayed with something," Frank suggested. "You go on ahead. I will wait until you get to the house." But as Teddy walked up the long dirt driveway toward the farmhouse, Frank noticed something that made his trained eye narrow with concern. The house was completely dark, no smoke from the chimney, no warm glow from the windows. For a family that was struggling financially, the Ashworths were usually careful to keep at least one room lit and heated during the cold months. Teddy reached the front porch and turned to wave back at the bus, but even from a distance, Frank could see the confusion on the boy's face. The child knocked on the door, waited, then knocked again more forcefully. Frank was about to get out of the bus to investigate, when Teddy's shoulders sagged in apparent relief. The door had opened, and while Frank couldn't see who had answered it, Teddy disappeared inside the house. A moment later, a dim light appeared in one of the front windows. Satisfied that the boy was safe, Frank put the bus in gear and continued toward the final stop of the route. Rosie McKinnon was waiting at her usual spot by the mailbox, but she seemed smaller somehow, more vulnerable in her wool coat and knitted cap. As she climbed aboard the bus, Frank noticed that her usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something resembling nervousness. "Everything all right, Rosie?" "I suppose so," she said, but her voice lacked its typical certainty. "Mr. Kowalski, did you ever find out what happened to that man this morning? The one with the broken-down car?" "No, I didn't." "Why do you ask?" Rosie was quiet for a long moment as the bus turned down the narrow lane that led to her family's farm. Finally, she spoke, her words barely audible over the engine noise. "I saw a car like his parked behind the mill when we were coming back from recess. But it didn't look broken down anymore." Frank felt that same chill from the morning, stronger now. "Are you sure it was the same car?" "Pretty sure. It had the same dent in the back bumper." They had reached the McKinnon farm, and Frank could see Rosie's mother waiting on the porch, just as she did every day. But something in the woman's posture seemed tense, expectant. As Rosie gathered her things and prepared to leave the bus, Frank made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Rosie, wait a minute." The girl turned back, her green eyes wide with curiosity. "If anything ever seems wrong, anything at all, you run straight to your parents, understand? And if you can't get to them, you find the nearest adult you trust." "Is something wrong, Mr. Kowalski?" Frank forced a smile. "No, sweetheart. Just an old soldier being cautious. You go on now. Your mama's waiting." Rosie nodded and climbed down from the bus. Frank watched as she ran across the yard and up the porch steps, where her mother gathered her into a tight embrace. For a moment, the scene looked perfectly normal, perfectly safe. It was the last time anyone would see Rosalind McKinnon alive. Frank completed his route by returning the bus to the township garage, where he performed his usual end-of-day maintenance check. The engine that had been running rough all week seemed to have settled down, purring smoothly as he backed it into its designated spot. As he walked to his own truck, Frank caught sight of Joe Brennan locking up the service bay. "Hey Joe," Frank called out. "Did you get a call today about a stranded motorist out on County Road 47? Dark sedan with engine trouble?" Joe shook his head. "Nope, nothing like that. Why?" "Just curious. Fellow said he was going to call for a tow. Must have found help somewhere else. Or maybe it wasn't as bad as he thought." Frank nodded, but the conversation only deepened his unease. In a community as small as Willowmere Township, where Brennan's was the only full-service garage for 20 miles, it was highly unlikely that a stranded motorist would have found alternative assistance. As Frank drove home through the gathering dusk, the first snowflakes began to fall, fat, wet flakes that clung to his windshield and melted immediately. The radio weather report had been accurate. They were in for their first real snow of the season. By 8 o'clock that evening, a steady snowfall had begun to accumulate on the roads and fields around Willowmere Township. By 9 o'clock, concerned parents were making telephone calls to each other, their voices tight with worry. Rosalind McKinnon had never made it home from school. Mrs. McKinnon had watched from her porch as the school bus disappeared around the bend, carrying her daughter toward what should have been a routine afternoon. But Rosie never walked through the farmhouse door. When darkness fell and the snow began to accumulate, Edith McKinnon knew with a mother's terrible certainty that something was catastrophically wrong. The telephone call to the township sheriff came at 9:20. Within an hour, every available man in Willowmere Township was bundled into coats and boots, armed with flashlights and lanterns, preparing to search the frozen fields and dark woods for an 11-year-old girl with copper braids and freckles. But they were already too late, and they had no idea that Rosalind McKinnon was not the only child who would fail to come home that night. Sheriff Harold Whitmore had been keeping the peace in Willowmere Township for 16 years, and in all that time, he'd never faced anything more serious than cattle theft or the occasional Saturday night brawl outside Murphy's Tavern. The most challenging case of his career had been tracking down whoever was stealing Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning pumpkins every Halloween. He was not prepared for what awaited him on the snowy evening of November. The call came through the township's single telephone line at 9:23 p.m. Edith McKinnon's voice fractured with panic as she reported her daughter missing. Whitmore, a methodical man in his 50s who still wore his hair in the military style he'd adopted during the Great War, immediately began organizing a search party. Within 30 minutes, headlights were cutting through the falling snow as trucks filled with volunteer searchers spread out across the township's network of dirt roads and farm lanes. Frank Kowalski was among the first to volunteer, his guilt and worry driving him through the accumulating snow toward the McKinnon farm. He'd replayed the afternoon's events dozens of times in his mind, searching for any detail he might have missed, any warning sign he should have heeded. The image of Rosie running up her family's porch steps haunted him. It seemed impossible that such a vivid memory could be the last time anyone had seen her alive. At the McKinnon farmhouse, the kitchen had been transformed into an impromptu command center. Men stamped snow off their boots as they gathered around the large wooden table where Sheriff Whitmore had spread out a hand-drawn map of the township. Edith McKinnon sat in the corner, her face pale and drawn, while her husband Paul paced the length of the room like a caged animal. "Frank, I need you to walk me through exactly what happened during your route today," Whitmore said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd learned to command respect through calm competence rather than bluster. "Every stop, every detail, no matter how small it might seem." Frank recounted the day's events, his military training helping him provide precise chronological details. But when he reached the encounter with the stranded motorist, Something in the sheriff's expression shifted. "Describe this man again," Whitmore interrupted. "40s, well-dressed, salt and pepper hair. Driving a dark sedan, looked like a 49 or 50 Buick. Said he was heading to Pittsburgh for a business meeting. License plate?" Frank closed his eyes, trying to visualize the brief glimpse he'd caught in his mirror. "Pennsylvania plates. The numbers. I think there was a 7 and a 3, but I can't be certain of the sequence." Sheriff Whitmore made notes in his careful handwriting, but Frank could see something troubling the older man. "Sheriff, is there something you are not telling us?" Whitmore looked up from his notepad. "Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. 3 weeks ago, I got a bulletin from the state police about a man matching that description. He's wanted for questioning in connection with some missing children down in West Virginia. They think he might be working his way north." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the soft hiss of snow against the windows. Edith McKinnon's sharp intake of breath cut through the quiet like a blade. "You think this man took our Rosie?" Paul McKinnon's voice was barely controlled, his farmer's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I don't know what to think yet," Whitmore replied honestly, "but we are going to find out." As the search parties organized and departed into the night, each group taking responsibility for a different sector of the township, Frank found himself paired with Dr. Edmund Crenshaw, the local physician, who delivered most of the children in Willowmere. Crenshaw was a thin, scholarly man who knew every family's history, every child's medical record, and every secret the community tried to keep buried. Their assigned search area covered the stretch of County Road 47 between the school and the Ashworth farm, including the spot where the mysterious motorist had been stranded. Armed with powerful electric torches and a kerosene lantern, they made their way through the falling snow, calling Rosie's name into the darkness. "Frank," Dr. Crenshaw said, as they approached Hensley's Bend, "I need to tell you something that's been troubling me all evening." Frank played his flashlight beam across the roadside, looking for any sign of disturbance in the accumulating snow. "What is it, Doc?" "I made house calls today. Routine checkups on some of the elderly folks who can't make it to my office. But when I stopped by the Ashworth place around noon, something seemed off." Frank stopped walking. "Off how?" The house was completely shut up, curtains drawn, no smoke from the chimney. "I knocked, but nobody answered. That's not like Martha Ashworth. She's always been a hospitable woman, and she knew I was coming." A cold dread began forming in Frank's stomach. "Did you see Teddy's father, William?" "That's just it. I haven't seen William Ashworth in over a month. Martha told me last time I was there that he'd gone to look for work in the coal mines down in Somerset County. But when I asked around town, nobody else had heard anything about William leaving." Frank's flashlight beam wavered as his hand began to tremble. The pieces of a horrible puzzle were starting to fall into place, but the picture they formed was too terrible to contemplate. "Doc, we need to get back to town. Now." They hurried through the snow toward Frank's truck, but before they could reach it, they heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. Headlights swept across the road, and Sheriff Whitmore's patrol car came to a stop beside them. "Frank, Doc, get in. We have got a problem." The drive back to town took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. Whitmore's grim expression and the way he gripped the steering wheel told them that whatever news awaited them was not good. At the township hall, which served as both sheriff's office and town meeting place, they found a scene of barely controlled chaos. Parents who should have been at home were gathered in worried clusters, their voices creating a low murmur of anxiety that filled the room like smoke. In the center of it all stood Martha Ashworth, Teddy's mother, her face streaked with tears and her hands shaking as she spoke to Deputy Russell Barnes. "I haven't seen him since this morning," she was saying. "He left for school just like always, but when the bus brought him home, her voice broke and she couldn't finish the sentence." Frank approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Mrs. Ashworth, what happened when Teddy came home from school?" The woman looked up at him with eyes that held a terrible emptiness. "That's just it, Mr. Kowalski. He never came home. But somebody did." The room went quiet as everyone strained to hear her next words. When I heard the bus stop out front, I went to the door to greet Teddy like I always do. But instead of my boy, there was a man standing on my porch, a stranger in a nice coat and hat. He said Teddy had asked him to tell me that the boy was staying after school for some special project. Sheriff Whitmore leaned forward. "Can you describe this man, Martha? Older than you, Sheriff, but not old. Gray in his hair, clean-shaven. He was very polite, very well-spoken. Said he was a teacher from the county office, checking on our rural schools." Frank felt the world tilting around him. "Mrs. Ashworth, what time was this?" "Right around 3:45. Same time Teddy always comes home." The man said not to worry, that he'd make sure Teddy got home safely later in the evening. "But it's been hours now," and her voice trailed off as the implications of her story sank in for everyone in the room. Frank realized with growing horror that he had delivered Teddy directly into the hands of whoever was responsible for the children's disappearances. "There's more," Deputy Barnes said grimly. "We have been checking on all the families whose children ride bus Route 7. The Hartley farm is empty. Looks like nobody's been there all day. Both Douglas and Vivienne are missing. And the Fitzgeralds?" Frank's voice was barely a whisper. "Lenny made it home safely. His parents confirm he arrived at the usual time and went straight to his room to work on homework. He's the only one we can account for." The weight of responsibility crashed down on Frank like a collapsing building. 4 children, 4 bright, innocent children, had vanished from his route. He'd been entrusted with their safety, and he'd failed them catastrophically. "Sheriff," came a voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see Joe Brennan, the garage owner, pushing through the crowd. His face was flushed from the cold, and his work clothes were covered in snow. "Joe, what is it?" "I have been thinking about what Frank asked me earlier, about that stranded motorist. So I went back to check the spot where he said the car was broken down." Brennan paused, and Frank could see the man's hands shaking as he removed his wool cap. "There's no oil stains on the road, no coolant, no sign that any car was ever in mechanical trouble there. But I found tire tracks leading off into the woods, like somebody deliberately drove off the road and parked out of sight." The implications were staggering. The entire encounter had been staged, a performance designed to case the school bus route and identify potential victims. Frank thought of Rosie's observation about the man's shiny shoes, her instinct that something wasn't right about the situation. Even an 11-year-old had seen through the deception that he'd missed completely. "There's something else," Brennan continued. "About half a mile into those woods, there's an old hunting cabin that belonged to the Patterson family. Nobody's used it in years, but when I was following the tire tracks, I could swear I saw light coming from that direction." Sheriff Whitmore was already reaching for his coat. "How many men can we muster?" "Every able-bodied man in the township," Paul McKinnon answered, his voice rough with determination. "Nobody's going home until we find these children." Within 20 minutes, a convoy of trucks was making its way through the snow toward the Patterson hunting cabin. Frank rode with Sheriff Whitmore, while Doc Crenshaw followed in his own vehicle with medical supplies, hoping against hope that they would find the children alive and in need of treatment rather than... Frank couldn't allow himself to complete that thought. The hunting cabin sat in a small clearing about a mile off the main road, accessible only by a narrow logging trail that hadn't been maintained in years. The building itself was little more than a one-room shack with a stone chimney and a single window, but it had clearly been occupied recently. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and warm yellow light glowed from the window. Sheriff Whitmore deployed his men in a wide circle around the cabin, then approached the front door with Frank and 2 other volunteers. The snow muffled their footsteps, but when they were still 50 yards away, they could hear voices inside, an adult male voice, calm and measured, and what sounded like children responding. Frank's heart leaped with hope. The voices suggested the children were still alive, still able to speak. Whatever was happening in that cabin, They might not be too late. Whitmore signaled for silence and crept closer to the window. Through a gap in the makeshift curtains, he could see inside the cabin. What he saw made his blood run cold. The children were there, Rosie, Teddy, Douglas, and Vivienne, but they were sitting unnaturally still around a small table, their eyes fixed on something outside Frank's field of vision. Their faces were pale, almost waxen, and their movements seemed slow and mechanical. At the head of the table sat the man from the morning encounter, but now his appearance had changed dramatically. Gone was the helpless motorist persona. In its place was something far more sinister, a figure who radiated control and menace despite his calm demeanor. "Now, children," they could hear him saying, "we are going to play a special game, a game about keeping secrets. The most important thing to remember is that some secrets are so special, so important, that we can never, ever tell anyone about them. Do you understand?" The children nodded in unison, their movements stiff and unnatural. Frank realized with growing horror that something was seriously wrong with them. They appeared to be drugged or under some kind of influence. "Rosalind, tell me what happens to little girls who don't keep their secrets." Rosie's voice, when she spoke, was flat and emotionless, completely unlike the spirited girl Frank knew. "Bad things happen to little girls who don't keep their secrets." "Very good. And Theodore, what happens to little boys who try to run away?" "Bad things happen to little boys who try to run away," Teddy repeated in the same lifeless tone. Sheriff Whitmore had heard enough. He signaled to his men and prepared to storm the cabin. But before he could give the order, disaster struck. One of the volunteers, overcome by rage at what he was witnessing, broke from his assigned position and charged toward the cabin door. His boots crunched loudly in the snow, and the sound immediately alerted the man inside. The warm light in the cabin window suddenly went out. "Children, it's time for the final game," they heard the man's voice say, no longer calm but sharp with urgency. "Remember what I taught you about the special sleep?" Frank didn't wait for orders. He sprinted toward the cabin, crashing through the door just as Sheriff Whitmore and the other men converged on the building. But they were seconds too late. The interior of the cabin was in chaos. The table had been overturned, and the children were collapsed on the floor in unnatural positions. The man was nowhere to be seen, but the back door of the cabin stood open, cold air rushing through the opening. Dr. Crenshaw rushed to the children, checking pulses and breathing. "They are alive," he announced, his voice tight with professional concern. "But barely. They have been drugged with something powerful. We need to get them to the hospital immediately." As the men carefully lifted the unconscious children and prepared to transport them to safety, Frank noticed something that made his stomach lurch. On the overturned table, illuminated by the beam of his flashlight, was a collection of items that chilled him to the bone. Rosie's copper braids, cut from her head and tied with ribbon. Teddy's glasses, the lenses carefully removed and arranged in a pattern. Vivienne's book report, the one she'd been so proud of, torn into precise strips. And Douglas's pocket knife, the blade stained with something dark. These weren't random souvenirs. They were trophies, collected with the methodical precision of someone who had done this before. Sheriff Whitmore organized a manhunt that lasted through the night, but the mysterious abductor had vanished into the storm as completely as if he'd never existed. The only trace they found was a set of tire tracks leading back to the main road, already being erased by the falling snow. At Mercy General Hospital in the county seat, Dr. Crenshaw and the emergency staff worked through the night to stabilize the 4 children. The drug in their systems was unlike anything the medical team had encountered before, a sophisticated combination of sedatives and what appeared to be experimental psychiatric medications. "It's like he was trying to erase their personalities," Dr. Crenshaw explained to the gathered parents as dawn broke over the hospital. "Their memories of the past few hours are completely gone, and they are showing signs of significant psychological trauma." The children recovered physically over the following days, but the psychological damage was more complex. They remembered nothing of their ordeal in the cabin, but all four were plagued by nightmares they couldn't explain and fears they couldn't articulate. Rosie, once confident and outspoken, became withdrawn and jumpy. Teddy developed a severe stutter that hadn't existed before. The Hartley siblings clung to each other constantly, as if afraid that separation would lead to something terrible. The investigation continued for weeks, then months. The Pennsylvania State Police sent detectives, and eventually federal agents became involved. The man's description was circulated throughout the region, and several similar cases were identified in other rural communities. But no arrests were ever made. The dark sedan was found 3 days later, abandoned in a cornfield near the Ohio border. It had been stolen from a Pittsburgh businessman 2 weeks earlier. Inside, investigators found more trophies, children's belongings from cases spanning multiple states, suggesting that the Willowmere incident was just one stop on a much larger, more horrifying journey. Frank Kowalski never drove a school bus again. The guilt of having unwittingly delivered the children into their abductors' hands haunted him for the rest of his life. He moved away from Willowmere Township the following spring, seeking anonymity in a larger city where his failure wouldn't be a daily reminder to everyone he met. The community of Willowmere tried to return to normal, but the events of November 15th had changed something fundamental about the place. Parents who had once allowed their children to roam freely across the farms and fields now kept them close to home. The easy trust that had characterized rural life was replaced by a weariness that never fully disappeared. The hunting cabin was burned to the ground by unknown persons one night in December, but the clearing where it had stood remained a place that locals avoided. Even decades later, people claimed that the spot felt wrong somehow, as if the evil that had transpired there had left a permanent stain on the land. Sheriff Whitmore retired 2 years later, never having solved the case that had defined the end of his career. In his final report he wrote, "The children of Willowmere were returned to their families alive, and for that we must be grateful. But the man who took them remains at large, and I fear that somewhere, in some other small community, other children may not be so fortunate." As winter gave way to spring in 1952, life in Willowmere Township gradually resumed its familiar rhythms. The children returned to school, though Rosie, Teddy, Douglas, and Vivienne were never quite the same. The scars they carried were invisible, but profound, marking them as survivors of something that defied explanation. But the case was far from closed. 3 months after the incident, Martha Ashworth received a letter in her mailbox. There was no return address, no postmark that could be traced. Inside was a single photograph, a group of children standing in front of what appeared to be an institutional building, their faces blank and emotionless, their eyes holding the same lifeless quality that had characterized the 4 Willowmere children during their brief time in the cabin. In the corner of the photograph, barely visible, was a familiar figure in a long coat and fedora. His face turned away from the camera, but his posture unmistakable. At the bottom of the photograph, in neat handwriting, was a message that made Martha's blood freeze. "The game continues. The children remember everything, even when they think they don't. They will come back to me when they are ready." Martha burned the photograph immediately, but not before making a discovery that would haunt her dreams for years to come. In the group of children pictured, she was certain she recognized a face, older, changed by time and trauma, but unmistakably familiar. It was her son Teddy, but as he might look 10 or 15 years in the future. 15 years later, October, the letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, addressed to Sheriff Harold Whitmore at his retirement cottage on the shores of Lake Chautauqua, New York. Whitmore had been expecting it for 15 years, though he'd hoped it would never come. The envelope bore no return address, but the careful handwriting was unmistakably familiar, the same precise script that had appeared on the photograph Martha Ashworth had received all those years ago. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored stationery and a train ticket to Pittsburgh, dated for the following Friday. The message was brief but chilling. "The children have remembered. The final game begins November 15th. Platform 7, Union Station, 3:15 p.m. Come alone, or they die properly this time. Whitmore's hands shook as he read the words. At 71, he'd thought his law enforcement days were behind him. His retirement had been peaceful, filled with fishing and woodworking, deliberately chosen activities that kept his mind occupied and away from the case that had haunted the end of his career. But the past, it seemed, was not finished with him. The train ticket was first class, an expensive gesture that spoke to resources and planning. Whoever had sent it wanted to ensure Whitmore would be comfortable on his journey to what might very well be his death. The date, November 15th, was no coincidence. It was exactly 15 years to the day since the children of Willowmere Township had vanished from school bus route 7. Whitmore spent the next 3 days putting his affairs in order, writing letters he hoped would never need to be delivered, and researching everything he could find about the 4 children who had survived that terrible night in night. What he discovered filled him with a dread deeper than anything he'd experienced during the original investigation. Theodore Ashworth had disappeared from a Pennsylvania State University dormitory in 1963, just weeks before his graduation with a degree in psychology. The official report listed him as a voluntary missing person. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. Simply there one day and gone the next. His mother, Martha, had died the previous year, taking with her the secret of the photograph that had revealed her son's future fate. Rosalind McKinnon, now married and living under the name Rosalind Fletcher, had suffered a complete nervous breakdown. She'd been institutionalized at a private psychiatric facility in western Pennsylvania, diagnosed with severe dissociative identity disorder and recurring nightmares that she claimed were actually recovered memories. Her husband had committed her after she'd been found wandering their neighborhood at night, searching for the man in the long coat and insisting that the game isn't over. Douglas Hartley had joined the military immediately upon turning 18, serving 2 tours in Korea before returning home in 9. But his sister Vivienne reported that her brother had changed dramatically during his service. He'd become obsessed with government conspiracies, convinced that his military unit had been used for psychological experiments that he couldn't clearly remember. He'd taken his own life in 1961, leaving behind a rambling suicide note that mentioned the cabin and the special sleep, and begged forgiveness for what I'm going to help them do to the others. Only Vivienne had seemed to escape the curse that had befallen her fellow survivors. Now a school teacher in Philadelphia, she'd married, had children of her own, and appeared to have built a normal, stable life. But Whitmore's investigation revealed troubling details even there. Her medical records, obtained through a contact in the Pennsylvania State Police, showed regular prescriptions for powerful sedatives and anti-anxiety medications. Her husband had filed for divorce twice, both times citing his wife's unusual behavior and obsession with protecting the children. The pattern was clear and terrifying. Whatever had been done to the children in that hunting cabin 15 years ago, the effects had been designed to manifest over time, like a slow-acting poison that took years to run its course. On Friday morning, October 28, 1966, Harold Whitmore boarded the Pennsylvania Railroad's westbound service to Pittsburgh, the expensive ticket ensuring him a private compartment where he could think and plan without interruption. As the train rolled through the autumn landscape of upstate New York and into Pennsylvania, he found himself remembering every detail of that snowy night in the hunting cabin, the overturned table, the children's lifeless expressions as they spoke in those flat, mechanical voices, the trophies arranged with surgical precision, and most of all, the man who had orchestrated it all, a figure who had vanished into the storm as if he'd never existed, leaving behind only questions and the seeds of future destruction. Pittsburgh's Union Station was a cathedral of steel and glass, its soaring ceilings and marble floors, designed to inspire awe in the travelers who passed through its halls. Platform 7 was located in the station's oldest section, where the architecture was more intimate and the crowds were thinner. Whitmore arrived at 3:10 p.m., 5 minutes early, and positioned himself where he could observe the platform, while remaining partially concealed behind a support column. At exactly 3:15, a figure emerged from the crowd. Not the man he'd been expecting, but someone far more shocking. It was Theodore Ashworth, but changed almost beyond recognition. The shy, bespectacled boy who had loved birds and books had become a tall, hollow-eyed man in an expensive suit. His movements were precise and mechanical, reminiscent of the drugged children Whitmore had found in the cabin all those years ago. When he spoke, his voice carried the same flat, emotionless quality that had chilled the sheriff's blood 15 years earlier. "Sheriff Whitmore, thank you for coming." "Teddy," Whitmore's voice was barely a whisper. "My God, boy, what happened to you?" "Theodore is no longer an appropriate name," the figure replied. "I am now Dr. Theodore Ashworth, Senior Research Associate at the Mannheim Institute for Behavioral Sciences. But you may call me Doctor." The Mannheim Institute. Whitmore had never heard of it, but the clinical way Teddy spoke the name suggested it was significant. The boy, no, the man who stood before him was clearly the same person who had been rescued from the hunting cabin, but everything else about him had been systematically stripped away and replaced with something cold and artificial. The others, Teddy, Rosie, Douglas, Vivienne, what's happened to them? They served their purposes. Rosalind provided excellent data on long-term psychological dissolution. Douglas contributed to our understanding of induced paranoia and its relationship to self-destructive behavior. Vivienne, he paused, and for just a moment, something almost human flickered behind his eyes. Vivienne was always the strongest. She's proved more resistant to the conditioning than we anticipated. Conditioning? Whitmore felt sick. You are talking about those children like they were laboratory rats. In essence, that's exactly what they were. What we all were. Teddy's expression remained unchanging. The Mannheim Institute has been conducting longitudinal studies on the effects of childhood trauma and behavioral modification since the Willowmere incident was one of several field tests designed to assess the long-term viability of our techniques. The pieces of the horrible puzzle finally fell into place. The mysterious man in the long coat hadn't been a random predator, he'd been a researcher, conducting an experiment on unwitting subjects. The hunting cabin had been a laboratory. The children had been test subjects in a study that was designed to unfold over decades. The man who took you, who was he? Dr. Ernst Mannheim himself, a brilliant scientist who understood that true behavioral modification requires patience and precision. What you witnessed in the cabin was just the beginning of a process that would take 15 years to complete. Whitmore's hand moved instinctively toward the service revolver he still carried out of habit. But Teddy noticed the gesture and smiled. The first expression the sheriff had seen on his face, and it was terrifyingly empty. "Violence won't solve anything, Sheriff. The process is nearly complete now. In fact, you are here to witness the final phase." "What final phase?" Instead of answering, Teddy turned and began walking toward the station's main concourse. Whitmore had no choice but to follow, his mind racing as he tried to understand what was happening and how he might stop it. They walked through the crowded station, past travelers hurrying to catch trains and families saying their goodbyes. To any casual observer, they would have appeared to be nothing more than a young professional and an elderly gentleman making their way through the terminal. But Whitmore could feel the malevolent purpose radiating from Teddy like heat from a furnace. Their destination was a private waiting room on the station's upper level, accessible only to those with special passes. Teddy produced such a pass from his jacket pocket, and they were admitted by a uniformed attendant who showed them to a richly appointed lounge overlooking the main concourse. Inside the waiting room, Whitmore was shocked to discover that they were not alone. Vivienne Hartley sat in a leather chair by the window, but like Teddy, she had been transformed by the intervening years. The spirited little girl who had invented stories about everyone she met had become a woman whose eyes held depths of knowledge that no human being should possess. She was dressed conservatively, like a governess or a private school headmistress, and when she looked up at Whitmore's entrance, her smile was warm and terrifying. "Sheriff Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying traces of the little girl he'd once known. "How wonderful to see you again. We have been waiting for you." "Vivienne, what have they done to you?" "They have completed me," she replied simply. "Just as they completed Teddy, just as they completed Douglas before his unfortunate incident, just as they completed poor Rosalind before her mind finally broke under the strain." Whitmore looked back and forth between the two former children, trying to reconcile these cold, clinical figures with the traumatized but innocent victims he'd rescued from the hunting cabin. "This is impossible. You were children, innocent children." "Innocence is inefficient," Teddy said, settling into a chair across from the sheriff. Dr. Mannheim understood that the human mind is most malleable during childhood, but that true behavioral modification requires a lifetime of careful cultivation. What you saw in the cabin was the implantation phase. The seeds were planted then, designed to germinate and grow over the following years. The nightmares, the psychological problems, the breakdowns, that was all planned. Carefully orchestrated, Vivienne confirmed. Each of us was monitored and guided through a specific developmental pathway. Douglas was conditioned for paranoia and self-destruction. Rosalind for dissociation and madness. I was prepared for what you might call deep cover operations, the ability to appear normal while serving the Institute's purposes. And you, Teddy, I was selected for recruitment. The brightest subjects, those who show the most promise, are eventually brought into the organization as full partners. It's quite an honor, really. Whitmore felt as if he were trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. The children he'd risked his life to save had been transformed into willing agents of their own destruction. "Why are you telling me this? What do you want?" Teddy and Vivienne exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes without words. When Teddy spoke again, his voice carried a new note of anticipation. "Today marks the 15th anniversary of our initial conditioning. According to the Institute's protocols, this is when the final phase begins. We are to return to Willowmere Township and complete the circle." "Complete what circle?" "The original experiment is to be replicated, but with certain improvements based on what we have learned over the past decade and a half. A new group of children will be selected, and the process will begin again. But this time, we will be the administrators rather than the subjects." The full horror of the situation crashed over Whitmore like a tide. They intended to return to Willowmere and repeat the nightmare that had destroyed their own lives. But now they would be the ones in control, the ones conducting the experiment on a new generation of innocent children. "I won't let you do this," Whitmore said, his voice shaking with rage and determination. "I will stop you, whatever it takes." "How?" Vivienne asked gently. "You are a 71-year-old retired sheriff with no jurisdiction and no evidence that anyone would believe. We are respected professionals with impeccable credentials and unlimited resources. Who do you think the authorities will listen to?" She was right, and they all knew it. The Institute had been planning this moment for 15 years, and they'd anticipated every possible obstacle. Whitmore was a relic from a bygone era, a man whose moment of heroism had already passed into history. But as he looked at the two figures before him, the broken remnants of children he'd once tried to save, something hardened in Whitmore's chest. He'd failed them once, 15 years ago in that hunting cabin. He would not fail them, or the new victims they intended to create again. "There's one thing you haven't considered," he said quietly. "And what's that?" Teddy asked. "You are not the only ones who remember that night." Before either of them could react, Whitmore reached into his jacket and withdrew, not his service revolver, but a small recording device that had been running throughout their entire conversation. It was primitive by later standards, but sufficient to capture every word of their horrific confession. "Frank Kowalski has been waiting 15 years for this moment," Whitmore continued. "He never stopped investigating, never stopped feeling guilty about what happened to you children. When I called him yesterday and told him what I suspected, He was ready to help. Vivian's composed expression flickered for the first time. Frank Kowalski is a broken man living in obscurity in Detroit. He's irrelevant. Frank Kowalski is a former Navy mechanic who spent 2 years learning everything he could about the Mannheim Institute and Dr. Ernst Mannheim. He's been building a case, piece by piece, waiting for the right moment to act. This recording will be in the hands of the FBI within hours. For the first time since their reunion had begun, Teddy showed genuine emotion, rage that contorted his features into something barely human. You don't understand the forces you are dealing with, old man. The Institute has resources you can't imagine. Government connections, international backing, politicians and judges and police chiefs who are all... His words were cut off by the sound of approaching sirens. Through the waiting room's windows, Whitmore could see police cars and FBI vehicles surrounding Union Station. The authorities were already moving into position, guided by information Frank Kowalski had been gathering for 15 years. The recording was just insurance, Whitmore explained as the sound of running footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. Frank has been in contact with a journalist named Bernstein at the Washington Post. The story of the Mannheim Institute and its experiments on American children will be front-page news tomorrow morning. The door to the waiting room burst open, and federal agents poured in with weapons drawn. But even facing inevitable capture, Teddy and Vivian maintained their eerie composure. "This changes nothing," Vivian said calmly as handcuffs were placed on her wrists. "We are just 2 operatives among hundreds. The Institute will continue its work, and other children will take our place in the program." "Maybe," Whitmore admitted, "but at least the ones in Willowmere will be safe." As the 2 former children were led away in custody, Whitmore remained in the waiting room, looking out over the bustling concourse below. He thought about the real Teddy and Vivian, the innocent, hopeful children who had climbed aboard Frank Kowalski's school bus on that cold November morning 15 years ago. Those children were truly dead, killed not by violence, but by a systematic process designed to steal their very souls. The Mannheim Institute was eventually exposed and shut down, its personnel scattered to the winds or imprisoned for their crimes. Dr. Ernst Mannheim himself was never found. He had vanished as completely as he had that snowy night in 1951, leaving behind only the wreckage of hundreds of young lives. Frank Kowalski testified before a Senate subcommittee investigating illegal human experimentation, finally finding a measure of peace in the knowledge that his 15 years of investigation had helped prevent other children from suffering the same fate as his former passengers. The 4 children of school bus Route 7 had their stories told in newspapers and congressional hearings, but for them the revelation came too late. Theodore Ashworth was found dead in his cell 3 days after his arrest, having somehow obtained a lethal dose of the same drug that had been used on him in the hunting cabin. Vivian Hartley was committed to a secure psychiatric facility, where she spent her remaining years insisting that the game never ends, and that new players are always being recruited. Willowmere Township itself became something of a pilgrimage site for those interested in government conspiracy theories and human experimentation. But the community that had once been defined by trust and neighborly concern never fully recovered from the knowledge of what had been done to its children. The hunting cabin where it all began was rebuilt twice by thrill-seekers and conspiracy theorists, but both reconstructions were destroyed by fires of unknown origin. The clearing where it had stood remained empty, marked only by a small memorial stone placed there by the families of the victims. But for those who knew the true story, the most chilling aspect was not what had been revealed, but what remained hidden. The Mannheim Institute had been conducting experiments for decades before the Willowmere incident, and its network had extended into communities across the country. How many other children had been taken? How many other families had been destroyed? How many other accidents and coincidences were actually the result of carefully planned psychological warfare against the most vulnerable members of society? On November 15, 1981, exactly 30 years after the children first vanished from school bus Route 7, Sheriff Harold Whitmore received one final letter. He was 86 years old then, living in a nursing home and suffering from the early stages of dementia. The letter was brief, written in the same careful handwriting that had haunted him for 3 decades. The seeds were planted deeper than you knew. The children you saved went on to have children of their own. The grandchildren are now the right age. The game begins again. Attached to the letter was a photograph. A school bus, yellow and familiar, parked in front of a rural elementary school. Through the windows, small faces could be seen, and in the driver's seat sat a figure whose features were obscured by shadows, but whose posture was unmistakably familiar. Harold Whitmore died 2 days later, clutching the photograph in his trembling hands and whispering warnings that the nursing home staff dismissed as the ramblings of a confused old man. The truth about school bus Route 7 died with him, but the legacy of that terrible November day continues to echo through the generations. In small communities across America, children still climb aboard yellow buses every morning, trusting that the adults responsible for their safety will protect them from the monsters that lurk in the world. Most of the time, that trust is well placed. But sometimes, on cold November mornings when the fog hangs low over the fields and the trees stand bare against the gray sky, parents in certain rural communities find themselves watching their children's school buses with unusual intensity, remembering half-forgotten stories about a township called Willowmere and 4 children who learned too late that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who come disguised as salvation. The game, as they say, never truly ends. It only finds new players.